Britain's Channel Islands are closer to France than to any part of Great Britain. The closest of the islands to France is tiny Alderney, A-L-D-E-R-N-E-Y, lying only 10 miles from the Cotentin Peninsula of northwest France, while it is some 60 miles to the closest point in England. The other 4 major islands of this group are Jersey, Guernsey, Sark, and Herm, H-E-R-M. Now, all 5 islands together contain a landmass of 75 square miles, which is only about 1/7 the size of Davidson County. Both Jersey and Guernsey have major seaports, Jersey's St. Helier and Guernsey's St. Peter Port. The year 1940 was not a good one for Britain. The war against Germany was going badly. Hitler's forces were meeting with remarkable success as country after country fell, including France, in the early summer. Britain was saved from invasion only by the skill and bravery of its Royal Air Force, and was perhaps saved from starvation by the heroic efforts of the RAF and the Merchant Navy, assisted by help from a sympathetic United States. Channel Islands during World War II, the only piece of British soil to fall under Nazi rule during the entire period. In the spring of 2003, my wife and I went on a cruise which began at Lisbon in Portugal, and from there sailed up the Portuguese, Spanish, and French Atlantic coast, ending at Plymouth, England. The last stop before we reached Plymouth was St. Peter Port on the Channel Island of Guernsey. We spent part of the day there, and from that experience I learned a little of what occurred there during World War II. Enough to whet my appetite for more information about the fate of this small island and its neighboring islands during the 5-year period from 1940 to 1945. To give you a little history and a few statistics, ever since the 13th century, the Channel Islands have been governed as dependencies of the British Crown, separate from the Kingdom of England and its successor kingdoms of Great Britain and the United Kingdom. The Isle of Man in the Irish Sea occupies the same status. Prior to the 13th century, the Channel Islands were part of France. Sometimes it is said that the culture of Britain and France meet in the Channel Islands. Politically, the islands fall into 2 self-governing entities. The bailiwick of Jersey, which consists of Jersey only, and the bailiwick of Guernsey, consisting of Guernsey and the other small islands in the group. Each bailiwick has its own legislature or parliament, known as the States of Guernsey and the States of Jersey. The 2 bailiwicks are administered separately and have no common laws between these bailiwicks, no common elections, and no common representative body. Each bailiwick has a representative from Great Britain called a lieutenant governor, who has no governing powers or duties. He acts merely as the channel of communication between the Crown and the government of the islands. The islands are not represented in UK Parliament, but the islanders are full British citizens. The United Kingdom has a constitutional responsibility for the defense of these islands. The total population now is about 165,000. The climate is temperate, with palm trees, vegetable cultivation, and rare snowfall. They are vacation destinations with interesting history and agreeable weather. France fell to the Germans in June 1940. The people of the Channel Islands, many of whom had friends or relatives just a few miles away in Normandy, were bewildered, confused, and fearful. Would the Germans occupy their islands, or would Churchill and the British come to their rescue and defend them? Much debate took place in Britain as to what course to take, but it was soon decided to demilitarize the islands, knowing that the Germans quickly would move in, which they did. Churchill did not feel they were strategic to the defense of mainland Britain. Also, the heavy British losses in France, including Dunkirk, were another reason given for the decision not to defend these islands. The few British troops were taken off the island by June the 20th, 1940, and the lieutenant governors were withdrawn the next day, leaving the island administrators to cope as best they could with impending German occupation. A few days later, amidst much confusion, they began the evacuation to mainland Britain of women and children, plus men of military age to serve in the British Army. They vacated their homes, businesses, and schools and headed for the harbor of the islands with all the possessions they could possibly physically carry. Some 30,000 men and women, 30,000 women and children were offered the chance to leave the mainland. The decision to go or stay was a difficult one for most, and for those who left, it would be 5 years before they would be reunited with family and friends who remained behind. Those who stayed suffered extreme deprivation. About 6,600 out of 50,000 left Jersey, while some 17,000 out of 42,000 left Guernsey. The evacuation of the islands itself was carried out by means of 6 ships sent from England just a very few days before the arrival of the German troops. For the next 5 years, very few islanders were able to escape voluntarily. Over 2,000 were, for various reasons, taken prisoner and deported to prison camps in Germany and other Nazi-controlled countries. But most attempts by islanders to escape to Britain were quickly thwarted by the Germans, who relentlessly patrolled and controlled the harbors and beaches of the islands. Hitler considered these islands a valuable landing stage for the invasion of mainland Britain, or mainland France, excuse me. Moreover, he had a personal fondness for the islands because of their beauty and climate, dreaming of them as a future vacation resort for his favorite Nazi friends. On June 28, 1940, the Luftwaffe bombed Jersey and Guernsey, unaware that the islands were undefended. 44 citizens were killed. One eyewitness described the raid as follows, quote, "The blood of the wounded and the dying mingled with the juice of the tomatoes." They were great tomato growers in those days. Tomatoes on the tomato carts lined up on the quay. And when I came on the scene, just as the last Hun plane faded into the distance, the sight was one I shall never forget. The flames, the bodies, the cries of the dying and wounded, and the struggling line of people emerging from shelter under the pier jetty. 2 days later, Luftwaffe personnel took over Guernsey's small and main airfield. At this point, the chief of police informed the Germans that the islands were undefended. Arrived on Guernsey, the German flag was raised. Simultaneously, more troops occupied the other islands, and Jersey surrendered on July 1st. The other 3 smaller islands a day or 2 afterward. In short, these small islands, just a short hop from southeastern England, had been completely taken over by German troops in 4 days, without a single casualty to their ranks. The islanders were required to show their compliance by flying white flags over their houses. A curfew was imposed. All weapons had to be handed over again. There was a ban on the sale of petrol. The airport was closed to all but military traffic, and clocks were required to be changed to Central European time. Hitler announced from his headquarters, quote, "Now we have 1 foot inside the door of the British Empire," on imposing its way of life on the islands. Imagine the depression and humiliation to a quiet, content, peace-loving people who were subjected to this almost overnight. Little did they know that their misery and troubles were just beginning and would increase tremendously as time went by.